Hello, my dears! I have one more video to film today and the sun is setting and I'm kind of stressed. But anyway, today is part 2 of my literature special interest. This is the part that's more of a special interest than the last part because it combines a few of my special interests and I am really excited. You already know what it is by the title, so doing some big reveal would be super pointless. But anyway, today we are going to talk about how all Disney princesses are autistic. Now, if you haven't seen my recent-ish video about neurodiversity in literature, you can check it out over here, but basically we talked about how some literature tropes are created by neurodivergent people and how we know this. And there are 2 reasons why we know this. The first part is that a well-rounded and well-written autistic character in literature in the past, before we had a name for autism and before anybody thought to do specific research on it and write a character from that perspective on purpose, it's likely that that type of person, we would now categorize them as autistic because every author puts a piece of themselves into every single character they write. So if every character of several of an author's stories has more autistic traits than neurotypical traits, we can safely assume that that author was probably neurodivergent. The second part is that tropes are created by somebody doing something super brand new, super out of the box, being mega successful, and then everybody copying it in some iteration, which means that a well-written trope of an autistic character, such as the absent-minded professor, has to, at some point, have an autistic person at the root of it all. We also discussed some examples of tropes, and 2 of them basically cover all Disney princesses. So to recap those 2, we have 1, the dreamer, essentially the femme version of the absent-minded professor in a way. It's the character that lives in books and imagination and is super intelligent and just a little bit odd, but a kindred spirit. So some examples of that include Luna Lovegood from Harry Potter, Anne Shirley from Anne of Green Gables, and Belle from Beauty and the Beast. And the second one is the blank slate. This is the character that seems to have no personality other than being generic, kind human. And that's not a bad thing, but they seem unnaturally perfect, and like, how does everybody like them? And one might just think that that's lazy character writing, but to an autistic person who tried far too long to chameleon their personality to cater other people as an attempt to be perfect and get friends, because maybe by being a perfect goody two-shoes, I would feel more comfortable and just fade into the background. Just a little bit too spot on. But anyway, some examples include Jane Bennet from Pride and Prejudice and Beth March from Little Women. So, to combine those 2 tropes, we have a girl who is smart, quick-witted, and a go-getter who doesn't totally fit into social norms, but at the same time, people can't get mad at her because she is generic kind human who happens to be friends with anything and everything and is kind all the time, even to random animals. And when you put it that way, all Disney princesses are absolutely, in every single possible way, autistic. Now, as much fun as it would be to break down every single princess and describe specifically what their story is and how their traits and tropes prove my point about them all being autistic, that would make this video several hours long, and I would have fun making it, but nobody would watch it, so I'm gonna do a general overview, and then I'm going to, over time, make videos breaking down individual princesses. Yes, I do have a spreadsheet going with facts and sources. Honestly, if I'd done this the way that my brain wanted to, I would have already covered them all, but I'm rationing them out. I'm rationing out the dopamine. So, we are going to talk about the 3 major dudes, or rather groups of dudes, from which we get the fairy tales that the original Disney princess movies and a few of the recent ones were based on, and what we know about them. So we're going to start with an easy one. My man Hans Christian Andersen. He's known for The Ugly Duckling, Thumbelina, The Emperor's New Clothes, The Little Mermaid, The Princess and the Pea, and The Snow Queen, which is now Frozen. He's also known for being a bisexual autistic icon, so I don't even need to prove to you that he's autistic because all of society has already collectively agreed that he was. But some overview, he was Danish, he lived from 1805 to 1875, and I might add that people didn't really like his fairy tales at the time that they were published because they were too different from the norms of children's literature stories at the time, which I will mention were terrible because they were pretty much just the Brothers Grimm, which we'll talk about them in a bit, but that's neither here nor there. He was a very restless dude, and he never felt quite like he fit in anywhere except the world of his own imagination. He lived a life of travel, art, and imagination, but also illness, loneliness, and depression. And now we know him as one of the greatest children's writers who shaped our culture. So there's that. He also wrote travelogues and other non-children's literature. I think there's a sci-fi book in there somewhere, and he grew to be very successful later in life. Not happy, but successful. Now, it's important to mention that many stories that have been turned into the princesses that we know today have been around as folktales for a long time. Cinderella, for example, can be traced back to the Egyptians. But even when writing down and adapting stories you've heard into part of your own collection, pieces of you still end up in the characters to an extent, especially the main characters. And when Disney picks stories to base their films off of, 9 times out of 10, they've been basing them off of a rendition made by one of these 3 dudes. Also, before you say, what about the lady writers? Many of these stories were actually originally created by women to tell their children, and then they were adapted and made famous by dudes, because this is all before, like, 1875, and sexism and patriarchy are a thing. Some of these ladies are traceable, in fact. For example, the woman who originally wrote Beauty and the Beast also seems really autistic, but we will get into that in my individual princess profiles, but I just wanted to point that out before we keep going. Alright, so our second dude is Charles Perrault. He was French and lived from 1628 to 1703. He's known for The Little Red Riding Hood, Cinderella, Puss in Boots, Mother Goose, and Sleeping Beauty. And every single article I read about him had a slightly different version of his story, which was immensely frustrating. So I've tried to combine them all into like the things that were similar. But anyway, he was friends with good old King Louis XIV, and he began life studying law and working in the government, which is kind of cool. So that's a career change for you. But basically, he lost his job at age 56 because his boss kind of died, and then he decided to dedicate his time to his children. So he wrote a book subtitled Tales of Mother Goose. Now, I might add that he's been credited for inventing fairy tales time and time again, when there was actually this lovely French lady by the name of Marie-Catherine Le Jumel de Barneville, Baroness d'Aulnoy, who created such a long name, who created fairy tales as well as the specific term fairy tale about 100 years earlier. And Perrault based his general formatting off of her stuff, so he didn't invent fairy tales, okay? Great. But anyway, he became known because in the late 1690s, he wrote a treatise reviewing an opera that began a whole argument between people who thought that modern art was equal to or better than ancient art, and other people who thought that ancient art would always be superior. And basically, he argued that modern things are superior to old things because they build upon the old things and potentially improve upon them. They can also make them worse, but he didn't say that. But anyway, this was all the rage, and it was all anybody could talk about, especially because he had written it in a, quote, unorthodox style. And that kind of was the style of everything this dude did. He managed to create a genre all of his own. He combined stories for entertainment with morals so that you learned something from the story, and that idea was kind of brand new to people. To be fair, it wasn't new because Aesop existed and Perrault loved Aesop, but you get my point. He kind of just combined folkloric tales with morals and then just added his own spin on things. And he was known for being a very strictly, aggressively moral guy, very religious, and very odd and a little unorthodox. And I would love to say that I have more evidence of his autisticness than that, in combination with like the cadence and word choice of how he writes based on the neurodivergent speech patterns that we talked about in my literature video. But finding sources about this dude was the most complicated experience that I have had finding a source in a very, very long time. But based on this evidence, I think we can safely assume that we have a neurodivergent dude on our hands because he comes across very absent-minded professor-like, and the way that his writing is fits that. And an absent-minded professor is the kind of person who's like very focused on one thing, but then everything else is just chaos around them, and their social skills are a little wonky. That's where that trope comes from. You can watch it in the video. Anyway, about 200 years later, in 1812, new versions in German of some of Perrault's stories were published along with many original stories by our third dude, or set of dudes. The Brothers Grimm, Jakob Ludwig and Wilhelm Karl Grimm. They were born in 1785 and 1786 respectively, and died in 1863 and 1859. Die Brüder, or the brothers, were also mostly collectors of fairy tales and are known for many classics like Cinderella, The Frog Prince, Hansel and Gretel, Rapunzel, Little Red Riding Hood, Sleeping Beauty, Rumpelstiltskin, and Snow White. They were super passionate about studying German language and literature, and they actually created the methodology for collecting and recording folk stories that is the basis of folklore studies as we know it today, which I think is super, super cool. The two of them churned out research at a speed that I have never before seen. And they also worked on making a German dictionary for quite some time. Unfortunately, they both died before they could get past the word Frucht, which means fruit. But anyway, they got caught up in a lot of political upheaval and on several occasions lost jobs because they chose to do what was right rather than what other people wanted them to do, which was apparently not what one did. And they published works about folktales from Denmark, Ireland, and some Norse mythology, as well as tons of German folktales, which were their number one focus. On top of that, Wilhelm was also chronically ill, so again, the speed at which they did research and publish stuff is astounding to me. But they were both very, very passionate about what they did, and even when it stopped bringing in money, which happened several times, they continued to do it, occasionally just picking up odd jobs and various things as needed to put food on the table. And of course, their fairy tales are known for being very, very gruesome, but that is because they were never meant for children. They were meant to preserve these stories for future generations to understand Germany better. Throughout everything on the Brothers Grimm, the number one thing is how their life was driven by their research. That was all they really ever focused on or talked about. So I'm gonna call Absent-Minded Professor on these two as well. I think we can safely say that. So at this point, we can pretty much say that the Brothers Grimm, Charles Perrault, and Hans Christian Andersen are all autistic and or neurodivergent in some manner. And as a result, all their characters must be as well, or at least their main characters, because those are the ones that they were writing emotions and action for the most. But what does this have to do with all Disney princesses being autistic? I mean, they didn't write all of the princess stories. And so now we head into a little Disney history for you. The first 4 princess films released by Disney were written by these 3 people. The first was Snow White in 1937, which was written by the Brothers Grimm, and then in 1950 we have Cinderella, which was both Perrault and then followed by Grimm, though the film mostly is based on the Perrault version. Sleeping Beauty in 1959 was again both Perrault and Grimm, and The Little Mermaid in 1989 was Hans Christian Andersen. And then after that was Beauty and the Beast, which was written by a seemingly very autistic Frenchwoman named Gabrielle Suzanne Barbeau de Villeneuve in 1740. And I don't think you need me to tell you that Disney is a brand who likes to stay consistent and true to brand, almost to a fault sometimes. So the first 5 movies of the Disney Princesses collection featured a princess who is smart, quick-witted, a go-getter who doesn't totally fit into social norms, but at the same time, people can't get too mad at her because she is generic kind human who is kind to everybody and happens to be friends with anything and everything, even random animals. All of the princesses have to follow this same pattern in order to fit into the princess idea. So every single princess that was written after those base 5, while taken from other folklore and things, was generally made to fit the exact same mold as a way to stay consistent. And really the only thing that's shifted in that narrative over time is that less of the princesses are getting married at age 16 or 14 in Snow White's case, / have love interests at all. And also there are people of color now, which is spicy and fun. But other than that, it's kind of the same character plopped into every film with a different plot around it. And the first 5 Disney princesses not only showed autistic traits in everything that they did, but they were based on stories written by neurodivergent people. And from then on, every single princess is written to be the same way. And thus, my thesis, all Disney princesses are autistic. And as I said in my last literature video, is armchair diagnosing a great thing to do? Not really. Should there be a diagnosis for every kind of character trope and way of speaking? No, but the reason that I do this is because just like with the advent of queer theory, it's how we can use a new lens to find forgotten and hidden identities in history and realize that people like us have always existed. And, in fact, created our culture the way that it is today. And it's how we can connect to art and see ourselves reflected in it and feel a little bit less alone. And that's what art's for. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this little adventure into special interest land. I definitely did. As I said earlier, I'm going to be rationing out my princesses so I can make princess profiles for a while, but let me know which one you want to see next. It's been super fun to dig into the forgotten histories of these things, and I might expand it outwards to covering other literature and media tropes as well as other fields of studies altogether, because science and autism. But we'll see how that goes. Anyway, thank you for listening, thank you for learning, and remember, your story isn't over. It has only just begun. You all are so very dear to me. Thank you for being here, thank you for supporting my content and me and everything. I really do appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.